When a financial crisis hits, when a tax code gets rewritten, when a bailout is approved, or when a major industry is reshaped, one group is almost always nearby, concentrated wealth, not always visibly in charge, but close enough to the machinery of decision-making to shape how the rules are written, softened, or enforced. This is not a story about dramatic corruption or secret envelopes passed under tables. It's about structure. About why, across centuries and across political systems, wealth consistently gravitates toward the state, and why the state, in turn, often gravitates toward wealth. Let's start with the central idea. The richest people in a country don't need to run the government directly. They simply need to be present when the rules get revised. And in modern political economies, rules are constantly being revised through tax reforms, regulatory exemptions, procurement contracts, competition rulings, crisis backstops, emergency guarantees, and fiscal interventions. Governments decide how income is taxed. They define what counts as legal risk. They determine which industries are strategic. They issue licenses, grant monopolies, approve mergers, and enforce or relax competition law. When panic hits markets, governments decide what gets rescued and what gets allowed to fail. That alone explains why concentrated wealth has a permanent incentive to remain close to public power even when nothing explicitly illegal is happening. The cleanest form of influence rarely involves breaking rules. It involves helping design them. Draft language gets shaped. Technical definitions get adjusted. Compliance burdens get structured in ways that advantage some actors and constrain others. Exceptions get embedded in tax codes. Enforcement timelines get delayed. The OECD's 2025 report on corporate influence in competition policymaking makes this point explicitly. When transparency and safeguards are weak, corporate participation can cross into undue influence long before any scandal appears. This pattern is not new. For centuries, states have depended on financiers, merchants, creditors, and industrial magnates. Kings needed court bankers. Empires needed trade networks. Modern states need debt buyers and tax revenue. Wealth, in turn, needs enforceable contracts, predictable regulation, protection from catastrophic loss, and legal systems that uphold asset values. The titles change: court banker, industrialist, private equity donor, lobbyist, strategic investor, but the relationship is recognizable. The state requires revenue, compliance, and stability. Wealth requires legal privilege, predictable rules, and protection against systemic collapse. That interdependence produces proximity. Once that interdependence exists, influence evolves beyond obvious corruption. It becomes procedural. Tax law becomes a battlefield. Licensing rules become a battlefield. Procurement frameworks become a battlefield. Competition law becomes a battlefield. This is why so much elite influence looks boring: a technical exemption, a narrow definition, a carefully framed compliance burden, a merger reviewed under one standard rather than another. Nothing looks explosive, but over time, these small structural adjustments accumulate into advantage. OECD research on competition policy highlights exactly this dynamic. Formal and informal corporate influence can shape policymaking long before any public controversy emerges. And then there's the revolving door. Officials move from regulatory agencies into industry. Industry executives move into treasury departments. Lawyers move between corporate firms and antitrust enforcement bodies. Career paths overlap. Professional cultures align. Policy definitions of reasonable begin to converge across public and private spheres. The OECD's 2025 analysis warns that revolving door employment can create incentives for regulators to temper enforcement or recalibrate risk decisions based on future career opportunities. This does not require overt corruption. It requires shared assumptions. Over time, what counts as responsible policy can begin to reflect the worldview of those who move most fluidly between sectors, and then a crisis arrives. In ordinary times, the proximity of wealth to power can feel abstract, but in crisis, it becomes visible. The system is under threat. Something must be saved. A line must be drawn between tolerable failure and intolerable collapse. The IMF's research on bailouts and systemic insurance states clearly that expectations of government support change private risk-taking behavior. That is the moral hazard problem. When firms believe they are close enough to power to be rescued, their risk calculations adjust. Rescue is never neutral. It may be necessary, but it signals where the state's protective boundary lies. When governments backstop bank liabilities, guarantee certain industries, or provide emergency credit facilities, they reveal which institutions are considered systemically intolerable to lose. The closer your wealth is to that boundary, the safer your position tends to be. The farther away, the more likely crisis shows up as layoffs, inflation, or household stress rather than a temporary liquidity squeeze followed by public support. Lobbying operates under the same logic. It's not always about buying one vote. It's about access, timing, technical input, and persistence. Who is in the room when draft legislation is shaped? Who funds the research cited in hearings? Who frames compliance burdens as job-killing or growth-enhancing? Who can sustain long-term engagement while others lack the resources to remain involved? The OECD's 2026 Integrity Report notes that many systems still lack robust safeguards against undue lobbying influence. Unequal access over time produces unequal policy even if no dramatic scandal occurs. This is what we might call asymmetric influence. Asymmetric influence exists when certain actors have more time, more expertise, more legal resources, more meetings, and more institutional endurance than others. It does not guarantee victory in every policy fight. It only needs to tilt enough outcomes in enough moments. Over decades, that tilt becomes structural. Tax codes become easier to navigate if you can afford the best navigators. Antitrust regimes become less threatening if you are large enough to shape process and precedent. Procurement becomes more accessible if you are already known and already scaled. Public debt becomes a stable asset class when the state is deeply committed to defending systemic credibility, and sometimes influence evolves into capture. World Bank research on state capture describes environments where elites shape the rules of the game itself, designing institutions and regulations in ways that systematically favor their own interests rather than merely securing occasional advantages. Corruption is a bribe. Capture is structural design. It is when privilege ceases to look exceptional and begins to look procedural. Public anger often arises from sensing this imbalance. Even if the mechanisms are not fully understood, people may not track every regulatory exemption or procurement decision, but they notice patterns. They notice which institutions receive urgent protection and which wait indefinitely for relief. They observe that governments can mobilize extraordinary speed and scale when core financial actors are under stress, yet move slowly when household distress accumulates. This perception matters because the state is becoming economically larger again. Public debt levels are elevated. Industrial policy has returned. Defense spending is rising. Governments are intervening in supply chains, energy markets, and technology sectors. Strategic industries are once again explicitly identified and supported. The more the state intervenes, the more valuable proximity to the state becomes. When credit allocation, subsidies, regulatory permissions, and crisis responses are centrally mediated, capital has every reason to remain near the point of decision. Wealth does not stay close to government because wealthy actors enjoy spectacle. It stays close because government defines which risks are cushioned and which are absorbed privately. Modern states are not merely referees. They are insurers, buyers, rule makers, debt issuers, and ultimate guarantors of systemic order. Of course, concentrated wealth wants to stand near that machinery. That does not mean every wealthy individual is corrupt or every public official is compromised. Those are overly simple narratives. The sharper insight is that modern political economies embed interdependence between concentrated wealth and state authority. Through debt markets, lobbying frameworks, regulatory design, crisis interventions, revolving career pathways, public contracts, and selective rescues, money remains close to power not as an anomaly but as a feature. Once you see that structure clearly, policy outcomes that once appeared random begin to look patterned, not because of a single master plan, but because the same institutional arrangements repeatedly reward proximity. In that sense, the system that keeps wealth near government is not a side effect. It is one of the ways modern states actually function. And that understanding changes the question. Instead of asking why the rich are always near power, we ask why, in a system where the state defines systemic survival, they would ever choose to stand anywhere else.